Test it. There we go. We're good. All right. I think everybody trickled in this morning. I see Chris. We'll give her a second. But good morning. Hope everybody had a good week. I've got a little eye condition going on this morning, so I can half joke about it. I'm still very annoyed, but I spent about 4.5 to 5 hours last night trying to get something out of my eyelid, and I think it's still there. And so, in trying all that, it's very irritated this morning, so it's kind of watering. So if I'm kind of doing a little squint and all kinds of stuff, then that's why. And it looks really bad. So anyway, just thought I'd let you know that so you're not wondering what's going on. But we are talking about beginning ministry this morning. So if you look at our schedule for class here, we spent the last 4 weeks kind of introducing the topic of becoming a spiritual leader, how God forms us as spiritual leaders over time, and then we talked about a couple of the first phases in this timeline that Robert Clinton outlines in his book, The Making of a Leader. So we talked about phase 1, the sovereign foundations phase. Last week we talked about phase 2, the inner life growth phase, and we broke down some of the process items within those phases in how God is developing us to advance on this timeline. We talked about patterns, processes, and principles, and what each of those mean and how God is developing those over time. And so we'll just take a little bit of a review and take a pause on what we've talked about so far. Here's the timeline from Clinton. And in phase 1, Sovereign Foundations, we talked about 5 process items that God can use to develop us and really start to embed some personality traits, characteristics, life lessons, experience that will ultimately form our principles and foundational truths and or prepare us for specific tasks that he's going to give us in the future. So those 5 were destiny preparation, which was something that is almost divinely orchestrated by God to hint or foreshadow at some special significance towards a spiritual gift or a life experience that you may come up against in the future. One of the examples that we used was Joseph having his dreams as a child, and ultimately that leading him into interpreting dreams for Pharaoh, gaining the trust of Pharaoh, and then leading Egypt in the time of famine. We talked about giftedness discovery, which is really how you learn the gifts that you might be blessed with by God at an early age. A lot of times it's just by doing. We're going to talk a little bit more about giftedness discovery today in the ministry maturing phase, and specifically beginning ministry. We talked about a mentor or a divine contact that might come into your life at a young age and really shape some of your foundational truths. I shared a young life leader that I had who was a great mentor for me early on and really taught me about relational learning with Jesus. Mark, you can stay on the previous slide if you don't mind. Thank you. And then we talked about spiritual authority, insights, and ministry affirmations, which kind of go hand in hand together, but are either encouragement from a peer or a teacher or someone that you know that's more mature than you are, or from God, where you really feel like what you're doing in this time period is being affirmed by either someone else or by God from what you're reading in the Bible or from, a specific feeling from the Spirit. Then last week we talked about the phase 2 process items: integrity check, obedience check, and word check, and what those mean specifically for us. Integrity check being something that really tests our values. It could be a variety of different things, but really puts those foundational truths that we're forming to the test to see how steadfast we're going to hold to those things. We talked about obedience checks, which are really answering a call or being faithful to God in the midst of hardship or circumstance. And then we talked about word check, which, again, all of these kind of overlap, but word check specifically would be receiving a specific passage or word from God and acting on that word and clinging to it. And it could be a verse that you came across that you felt was really moving to you, might have shaped the foundational truth, or it might have changed your behavior if you were convicted by that and decided, hey, I need to change some things that I'm doing based on what I'm reading here in the Bible. Okay, so before we move on, I'd love to hear from a few of you. We haven't had a lot of discussion yet because there's just so much to get through in this book, and I want to make sure that you kind of get the full picture. But a couple questions I want to pause and ask you. Number one, as we've gone through these first 2 phases and really covered the entire framework, if you've been here, I would love to hear from someone. Do you feel like your life has matched this pattern? Again, we talk about this is a a linear timeline in a very non-linear world. So I'd love to hear from someone, do you feel like you identify with this timeline? Has your life matched this pattern? Or do you feel like this is not even close to the experience that I've had so far? Oh, okay, great, Chad.
I feel like I'm like still in the ministry maturing stage because I'm like just trying to discover where I'm supposed to be at in this process, and it's a slow process, but I'll get to where I think I need to be.
Do you feel like there are process items that we've talked about that you can see parallels in your life from phases 1 and 2?
1 and 2, yes, definitely invest in preparation and the spiritual building science because I've had my grandpa and then I've got my uncles that were in the church of Christ their whole life. And, I was raised in it too, so yes, they're all been part of that too. And I've had some integrity and obedience checks also. So
got it. Awesome. Yeah. Okay, great. Hey, thanks for sharing. I appreciate it. Anybody else? Okay, how about somebody or two more people give me one example. You don't talk about the whole thing. Give me one example of something that you feel like, if so, one of these process items that you've seen at work in your life. Yes.
Well, I didn't grow up in the church. We didn't really go to church. Neither one of my parents, they believed, but we just didn't go to church. So when me and my brother were probably junior high school age, we went to the church that had the fun, and all of that stuff. But there were some really good mentors there that did, really show us the ways, stuff like that. And so I feel like the mentor in the faith one was, a big part of why I still go to church, stuff like that, and pray every day.
Yeah, excellent. So, just someone that modeled maybe some values and beliefs that you kind of gravitated towards and shaped you from a young age, even though you didn't grow up in church. I think that's great. Okay, one more.
So let me give you the opposite of that.
Okay.
So growing up in the church my whole life, you look and you think about each one of those things as you started in your little kids class and you're learning about the Bible stories and so on and so forth. And then as you get to the youth group and you have your youth minister and you have all the things that go on there, I mean, you're just following the steps as you're aging, looking at this. Of course, we haven't been here, so it's the first class, but it's like I see it and I'm going, yep, just checking off the boxes as you grew up in the church. Again, opposite of the other experience, but I think, growing up in the church, everybody did a good job to hit those points as we were learning and growing. Our teachers and our youth ministers and things like that were already helping us get those foundations, to get that inner life growth, for us to hit adulthood or this ministry maturing part as we were maturing to get to that next step.
Yeah, I love that. And I had a very similar experience growing up in church as well, but I think the value of this is going through and kind of understanding these process items and then retroactively applying them to your life to say, okay, it's not that someone asks me about my faith and I say, well, I just kind of grew up in church and was baptized and, went to ACU and that was my story. No. My story is that I was born into a family who imparted the values of Christ in me from a young age. There was some destiny preparation there. God was already forming me in a mature spiritual family. He brought a mentor into my life from a young age who took that to the next level and said, you know what? You might have learned about a lot of, Old Testament and a lot of about Jesus, but you don't really know him. There's this relational aspect that you really need to hold on to and grasp and create this one-on-one connection. There were ministry affirmations from people in church and teachers at school that really encouraged me, even though I may have been a little different than a lot of folks at school and, led a student-led Bible study before classes, and we didn't necessarily have a lot of people there, but they affirmed me, hey, keep going. This is a great thing that you're doing. The integrity checks, the obedience checks, the word check, you can look back and see these minute things or maybe even negative experiences. Clinton would call it negative preparation that was shaping who you are. So I think that's where a lot of value lies in this timeline is, taking the ordinary and recognizing that was not ordinary. That was God moving in your life, even in seemingly small things. And so I hope you get that out of this as we move forward. And the other component is, as we are maturing and now adults and we understand these particular process items that we're going through, that helps us prepare for our children and maybe create an experience like that for them to say, okay, I found value in having a mentor. Now I want to in turn be a mentor for someone else because I know how impactful that was for me in my own faith journey. Okay, awesome. So that's the timeline we've covered so far, and we'll go through some more examples of that as we wrap up and go over the timeline after we talk about phase 3. So phase 3, ministry maturing, is a really big phase, and so we're going to break that up into 2 parts today. Today we're going to talk about the first part, beginning ministry, and we're going to transition from this inner life growth phase where God is really working in us to build character, to build integrity. We talked about how important that was last week. Clinton says integrity is the true measure of the inner life, and we define character as something or what we do in the dark, right? And we talked about how God will not use a leader who lacks integrity. We talked about King Saul when he was supposed to destroy the Philistines and leave no animals, leave nothing, just burn it all, and he didn't do that. And God used the prophet Samuel to come to him and say, hey, you weren't faithful, you weren't obedient to what God asked you to do, and so the kingdom's going to get taken away from you. And so we talked a little bit about a couple of other examples, but Clinton says character development really comes before ministry with those 3 checks that we talked about last week: integrity check, obedience check, and word check. And then, as a bit of review in our Sovereign Foundations phase, we talked about God is already working through our lives with our embedded personality traits, the events that happen, the places we go, the places that we're born into, and through other people. And so now he says we'll transform from receiving to giving. And this is that phase that we transition into where we shift from kind of God working in us to now God working through us. So let's talk about phase 3, ministry maturing, here on the next slide. And this is a framework again, right? Doesn't always apply age-wise, but as an idea. A lot of times in the ministry maturing phase, this is kind of our early adult years. You may be married already, you may be active in your first job, you may be in your second job, but this is where we really start to come into our own faith. We start serving the Lord very actively. People are actually asking us to serve specifically, and we, depending on how we react to those tasks, depends on how quickly we advance through this stage and the giftedness discovery that we're going to talk about. So through these ministry tasks and through these ways that we start serving, we start to really experiment with our spiritual gifts. We start to learn our gift mix. We might feel drawn to a specific task or a specific calling within the church and really start to dive into that a little bit. We learn how to work with people relationally. And we'll see next week as we talk about transitioning out of ministry maturing, relational learning and understanding how to interact with folks, how to deal with conflict, how to do it with grace is really something that earmarks this particular phase and moves us into the next phase. So that's kind of more on the back half, but it's a really important part of ministry maturing is, when things get tough, when there's conflict or disagreement in a spiritual manner, how do you deal with that? A lot of times there is a period of education and training in this phase. It could be very informal or it could be formal. And for me, I'll talk a little bit about this later, but I feel like some of the training and education that I've had in this phase has been kind of professionally in my day job. Some of the conferences I've been to around leadership, some of the material that I've read professionally, I think is a lot of crossover into spiritual leadership. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be that you went to get your MDiv or you went and took a bunch of classes online. It could be that you read a book. It could be that you dove deeper into the Word. It could be you attended a Bible class. But there's oftentimes a period of training and education in this particular phase. And we shift from being, kind of absorbing information to sharing that back, being productive and fruitful. And this is the bookend of God's stages 1 through 3 of working inside of us. So one example that I thought of for ministry maturing was Joseph being placed in prison. This is a bit of a tough stretch for him after he has been faithful and served Potiphar's household. Potiphar's wife came onto him, he denied her, and now he's been put in prison. But in this time, the Bible talks about how the warden of the prison puts Joseph in charge of all the prisoners, and the Lord is with him, and the Lord blesses him. That's when he then starts to interpret dreams and have dreams, and ultimately God is preparing him to serve Pharaoh and to lead Egypt in the future. But this is that kind of phase where Joseph is really starting that process, and God is preparing him for that. One quote that I shared before on this, but I think is really important to keep in mind, especially as some of us might be in this phase right now. Clinton says, many might become frustrated in this phase by the fact that God is working in us. They're constantly evaluating productivity and activity while God is quietly evaluating our leadership potential. We minister out of what we are. And while it's true that God is still working in us, but at the same time we're starting to be productive and fruitful, I think what's important to keep in mind is that this is the phase of the most growth that typically happens, where we are, not only being active and serving, but God is still working in us at the same time. So you're kind of getting this convergence of both happening, where God's working in us, God's working through us, and we can't get frustrated by a lack of progress or a lack of success sometimes. We've got to keep pressing on. All right, so that's phase 3. Today, we're going to break that into a couple parts, but maybe a guiding scripture for us in this particular phase is Luke 16, chapter 16, verse 10. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much, and whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. And this is really the key scripture of this phase, and really answering the question, how do I respond to the opportunities that are being given to me in this phase? Am I going to be faithful and respond to those positively or not? And Clinton will say, depending on what we do with what we're asked to do, really dictates our development and how long it might take us to stay in this phase or to move forward to the next phase. Okay, so there's 4 parts to the ministry maturing phase. We're going to talk about the first 2 today. The first one is entry, where God is starting to invite us into ministry. The second one is training, where we start to develop skills and gifts as we are invited into ministry. And he says oftentimes when we're invited into ministry, we want to feel well equipped for that, right? So we might recognize some shortfalls, and we might proactively go through some training to develop the skills and gifts necessary to respond to the tasks that we're being asked to do, or what we're volunteering to do, what we're the ways that we're serving. Number 3 is relational learning. We talked about this already, but this is how we start to relate to people, both positively and negatively. We talked about spiritual leadership as a barometer, depending on how much we can actually influence someone, whether it's one-to-one or one-to-many. But spiritual leadership is really the ability to influence. So relational learning is a very critical part of that, in learning how to relate and influence people of all walks of life. And then last is discernment. Can we learn some spiritual principles that will guide us into the life maturing phase? And conflict resolution is one of these. Dealing with authority is another one of these. Learning submission is another key part of discernment. And we'll talk about that one a lot more next week. But submission becomes very important in the leadership development process, specifically in a spiritual context, as God says, obedience doesn't always hinge on understanding. We talked about that a little bit last week, and learning submission is a key part of that. Okay, let's dive into entry and talk about a couple of process items that happen in this first phase. Number 1 is a ministry task, and this is an assignment from God that tests our faithfulness and obedience and using one's gift. In its simplest form, this is probably someone asking you to do something very simple. It typically has a beginning and an end, and it can be measured. So a couple of examples of this, being asked to serve on a committee, teaching a Bible class, helping with the ministry, being asked to do communion, being asked to teach a children's class, going to someone's house and providing them a meal. These are often very, very simple tasks that we can measure. You either respond or you didn't. It's kind of a pass-fail thing. But the goal is to really realize that this task is not from the person asking you to do this. This is from God, who is preparing you for greater ministry tasks in the future. And the goal is to please God by responding positively to this. So a couple of biblical examples in Acts chapter 11. Barnabas being sent to Antioch and the way that he responds to that. Epaphroditus being sent to Paul. And a couple of others that I thought of from a ministry task perspective. Now I'm blanking. I don't have it in my notes. Anyway, let's move on. But hopefully you get the idea of the ministry task. And Clinton says small ministry tasks can be early indicators of leadership potential. So a couple of ministry tasks that I can think of that I had to go through was being asked to mow the grass at church when I was in high school, being asked to lead a Bible class for the youth group, being asked to lead a prayer at communion almost every Sunday. But what I realized is, as you respond to those, there are more opportunities that open up for you. And sometimes at that age, I was maybe a bit annoyed by that, like, oh, I just did this, and you're going to ask me to do it again. But, looking back now, that was really positive responses leading to more opportunities for me to serve and to please God. And so, how grateful I am now to know that because I said yes to those things, there were more opportunities for me in the future. Any small ministry tasks that anyone can remember that stand out to them in their life? Yeah, Chris?
At our old church, we had a secretary that was leaving. She moved, and they didn't have a church secretary, so I volunteered to kind of help fill that role. And I don't know, I felt like it was just a really good, practical thing for the time in my life, and I wanted to be able to serve, but I think it really taught me a lot about the ins and outs of helping the church run smoothly, and maybe just helping me develop some skills that I really didn't plan on. I literally was just like, yeah, of course I can check the mail and stuff. But it was way more than that. And I did volunteer, but I didn't really know what I was volunteering for. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I can think of that one as okay, I think that was a task that the Lord presented to me to be able to fill a role for our church that I didn't really know that was so impactful.
Yeah, absolutely. That's another one that's seemingly simple and doesn't have flashy outcomes, but understanding that that's from God, that's a test of faithfulness, I think is it kind of helps bring weight to what you're doing. So great example. Anyone else? Yes.
I think that
Gina.
as a church, we give 2 examples every year. We do Gear Up. That's a ministry challenge for our whole community.
Yeah.
As a church, we do that. And then secondly, we do Mission Sunday. When we continually talk about it and get ready to give. So as a church, I feel like we offer 2 mission challenges to our whole congregation.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So let's talk about the ministry challenge, the second one, which is a little bit different than a ministry task. This is more of an assignment from God that is maybe a bit longer lasting than the ministry task, whereas the ministry task has a very tangible beginning and ending, could be over the course of one Sunday. A ministry challenge could be, lasting an entire quarter. It could be a specific calling. It could be a mission trip. But this is really an assignment that God uses to impact us in helping us to discover our gifts, maybe becoming aware of a spiritual calling or a gift mix, a strength. And the key here is that it focuses on acceptance, right? So hopefully, for most of us, this is a moment where we can see God's direction in what's being asked of us, and that helps us to respond positively. Whereas with the ministry task, it may not be quite as clear. It may just be something really small. A ministry challenge might be more like, hey, would you be willing to lead this small group? Would you be willing to teach a specific class here at church? Would you be willing to serve on a committee, right? The preacher search committee might be a great example of a ministry challenge for some folks who were asked to serve on that, and came with a lot of conflict, came with a lot of discussion, right? But ultimately, their response to that was being faithful to God's calling and really serving our church in that way. So Clinton says ministry tasks and ministry challenges build on one another as we respond faithfully to them. So, sometimes these are happening simultaneously, sometimes not, but when we react to them, either negatively or with less enthusiasm, it's a sign of maybe stalled growth. So positive reactions lead to more opportunities. Negative reactions lead to maybe less opportunities and stagnation in our own spiritual development. I remember when we were at Southside a few years ago, I was teaching a class and someone asked me, hey, would you also be willing to lead communion? And maybe in a moment of spiritual immaturity, I said, hey, sorry, I'm already teaching class. I don't think I could take that on. And then I didn't get asked to do that for like 2 years. And I found myself at times wishing like, oh, I really wish I could get up there and share communion. But I didn't get asked again because I responded negatively to that, right? And sometimes that's all it takes is one no, and that person is not going to ask you to do something again. So that really impacted me, and I had a moment where I said, you know what, I'm not going to say no to anything anymore that someone asked me to do, because I see the impact that it had and the opportunities that I had kind of dried up to do that. So even though I was doing something else, that didn't mean that I should have said no to that either. Okay, let's talk about training a little bit. So we talked about entry, right? God invites us into ministry through the ministry task or the ministry challenge or a combination of both. Training is the acquisition of skills to help us fulfill a specific ministry task. So, in earlier years, it could be formal education, getting a degree. It could be mentoring someone or being mentored by someone else. It could be a form of informal education, like I talked about. Hey, read a book, attend a class, go to a workshop. You might have inputs from your professional life that are kind of shaping some training for you and developing some skills. Or it could be observation. Sometimes we learn more just by observing and listening and absorbing, and then we reciprocate that and kind of copy it and use some of what we've observed to shape the way and style that we use our spiritual gifts. And Clinton says our spiritual development becomes really kind of stalled when we stop trying to gain greater skills, and says, a lot of people might hone in on one specific skill. For me, it could be, teaching or sharing, and then we just kind of stop with that and say, okay, I've got this is my niche, this is what I'm going to do, and I'm not going to gain any more skills at all, right? Whether it's, let's just use the teaching example. You might be really good at lecturing, or you might be really good at asking questions, but you never develop that full, broad scale of owning a room and leading a room, reading a room, and adapting your leadership style to the room itself or the audience, right? So it can be difficult to move ahead sometimes when we feel like we're adequate enough, but gaining new skills and learning new skills is really what moves us into deeper spiritual leaders. So a couple of biblical examples, right? The Paul and Timothy relationship, the mentoring relationship between them. Jesus and his disciples, there were a lot of training going on there. The disciples being so young and impressionable, and Jesus having to kind of turn their world upside down and teach them that, the new gospel was a lot different than anything they'd ever read or thought of before. Paul writing letters to Timothy and Titus, really encouraging them and continuing to mentor them. And Clinton says, all leaders are constantly being trained by God, but not all of them learn from the training. So hopefully, as we go through periods of training, we can kind of recognize them and absorb the information and take it away and put it into practice rather than just letting it roll in one ear and out the other. All right, a second part of training is discovering spiritual gifts. So we talked a little bit about giftedness discovery already, but this is a critical component of spiritual leadership, is identifying the gift mix that we have. And how we can do that is kind of realizing that through a particular event, person, or experience. Often the ministry tasks, the ministry challenges will help us understand what our gifts are. A gift cluster is kind of a mix of gifts related to one another. So if you have the gift of encouragement, you might also be really good at one-on-one communication. You might also be really good at sharing the gospel one-on-one with someone, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be only good at encouragement. If you have the gift of teaching, you might also be good at leading in other ways. You might be good at evangelism, or you might be good at speaking to very large crowds and influencing them through lecturing. If you don't feel like you know your gifts very well, one barometer that you can use is attractiveness to other people. And Clinton says we tend to be attracted to people who have similar gifts, and we tend to be energized for ministry tasks that correspond with our gifts. So one of the ways that I felt like I knew I wanted to teach in the future is that when I was a kid and growing up, I was always attracted to the person who was up on stage talking. And I always wanted to know that person. I always wanted to know how they thought, how their brain worked, and how they prepared, and just kind of learn the intricacies of what it took to be up on stage speaking. And because I felt that attractiveness, then I started to look for opportunities that would allow me to do that. As nerve-wracking as it was, I used to spend hours preparing. I would type out my entire speech. I would go up to the church the day before, and I would practice it like 5 times. And I would basically just memorize the entire thing so that it looked like I knew what I was doing. And over time, as I continued to refine that, it became more of, okay, well, now I'm just going to give some bullets, and I'm going to practice a little bit and practice a little bit. And then you do it enough times, and it just kind of becomes part of who you are, and you get comfortable with it. But I think that's a really good indicator of kind of understanding what gifts you might have or God that bestowed upon you is by looking at other people, and those that you feel attracted to oftentimes have a similar gift mix. Maybe one of the easiest examples we can reference from the Bible is Barnabas. Anybody want to share what they feel like Barnabas' gift was? Encouragement, exactly. Encouragement. So I think that's even in his name specifically. But Barnabas discovered this gift of encouragement just by being active in a church. And I think also, a lot of people may not know, but Barnabas really is the one who called Paul into ministry and mentored him. We often don't think about that, but Barnabas was an incredible encourager for Paul to launch him into his own ministry, in addition to several others that he also mentored and encouraged throughout his time as well and in the church. Clinton says spiritual gifts are a unique capacity for channeling the Holy Spirit's power into ministry. And I love that definition, because oftentimes we can think of it as just personality traits or, tasks specifically. But if you think about it as channeling the Holy Spirit's power into ministry, it takes on a whole new meaning. So I really like that definition. All right, so let's wrap up with a review of the timeline again, and let's look at Joseph and start to define his phase 3 into ministry maturing. So we talked about him growing up with his brothers in the Sovereign Foundations phase. We talked about being bestowed that ornate robe by his father, maybe being a sign of destiny preparation for him to start to take on a leadership role and rule over the others. In addition, the 2 dreams may have been some destiny preparation for him, or some spiritual authority insights preparing him to lead Egypt in the future. His second phase, inner life growth, we talked about Potiphar's wife tempting him, the way he responded to that being an integrity check. We talked about the dreams that he was having being a word check specifically from God, preparing him for the dreams that he would interpret in the future. And then serving Potiphar's house being an obedience check. Despite the circumstances, despite being sold into slavery, serving them with honor and being obedient to God during that time. And then ministry maturing, being put into prison. So a couple of ministry challenges maybe we could talk about. The warden putting Joseph in charge and trusting him to take care of all the prisoners. And it says God really blessed him in this time. And then second, interpreting dreams. That was another kind of challenge or task that he had, that he was given when he was in prison, and ultimately leading him into the next phase. So that's the first two components for ministry maturing in Joseph's life. Let's look at my life again. So we talked about phases 1 and 2 here with me before, but phase 3, ministry maturing, right? This is the time that I think I'm still in. From the first time, got some job promotions in 2017, 2018. We had kids. We had our second move here just last year. But a couple of process items in the ministry maturing phase for me. A ministry task or challenge, teaching classes at Southside. We actually volunteered to lead our small group there after the previous couple stepped down. And that was a really challenging time. I think that was a ministry challenge with some negative preparation for us. We started to take that on I want to say it was right when COVID hit or right after COVID hit. And I think some really creative ways to engage people. And I'll be honest, I think we just kind of failed. And I don't know that it was our fault specifically, or may have just been the circumstance, but we started out with a really big group, 20, 25, 30 people. And by the end, we couldn't get people to sign up for anything. We couldn't get people to attend anything at all. And so that was a really challenging time to try to understand, okay, how do we influence and reach people despite them kind of pulling back or not wanting to be as involved as they were before? We've lost all this momentum. How do we regain some of this momentum? And, just really taught us some principles about how to lead in times of struggle rather than just when everybody's there all the time and it's easy. And then honestly, some training that I went through was reading this book and kind of understanding this framework and how it applied to my life. And I found a lot of value in being able to share an impactful testimony about my faith, despite just being someone who grew up inheriting their faith, going to church, going to ACU. It seemed very boring to me. And then after I went through this book, I realized there were God-ordained moments sprinkled in all throughout my life that I could look back on and see where God was moving. So those are a few process items for me in this phase, and there will be a couple more as we talk about the second part. So remember, today we talked about entry, we talked about training, we still have relational learning and discernment to go over next week. And so a couple things to be thinking about. I know the bell rang, but think about some key process items for you, not only in this phase, but in your first 3 phases. Think about how that kind of matches up to the patterns that you've observed in your life, and if you feel like your life matches up to them or not. And then third, think about a spiritual gift that God has blessed you with and how you found it. A lot of times I'm interested to understand how that happened as well. So we'll pick up next week on these discussion topics. So hopefully you'll come prepared to share a couple of examples of process items and a couple of examples of spiritual gifts. So we'll see you next week. Thank you.